その日、人類は思い出した。奴らに支配されていた恐怖を。
We didn't know it yet, but this was the sequence that would kick off the series that would define an entire generation, the series that would unite all anime fans, the series considered by many to be the best of all time. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. All good things must have an ending. And as far as SNK is concerned, this ending caused a huge divide. For some, it was good. For others, it was so bad that it single-handedly called into question their entire appreciation of the work. And in this video, we're going to focus more on the latter group, because to back up their opinions, they've pointed to inconsistencies. So in this video, we're going to set the record straight and even explain the real reasons for their dissatisfaction. Because spoiler alert, there are no inconsistencies in Attack on Titan.
お前らが大事だからだ。他の誰よりも。だから、長生きしてほしい。
In my view, the biggest problem with the various critics of the ending is that they haven't understood Eren's character, and I'm not talking here about his characterization, but rather his objectives. You have to understand that the welfare of Paradise Island was never a priority for Eren. For one need only ask, what was the best course of action for him if he truly wanted to save Paradise? And the answer is rather simple, and has in fact been provided by history itself. The mini Great Earthwork was by far the most effective solution, because in fact, it does not merely buy Paradise a reprieve from the rest of the world. Demonstrating to the world that Paradise can deploy the Great Earthquake is like being the only world power to possess the nuclear bomb and in practically infinite quantities. This means that Paradise can achieve far more than a reprieve. It can even conquer a large part of Maha's territory and force them to hand over their 4 primordial titans. Or to put it another way, to seize the economic and military power of the world's greatest power. Once this power is in hand, it remains entirely possible to prove to the whole world that their objective is not to dominate, but rather to create a world of peace. And if one truly wishes to go further and genuinely guarantee Paradise's security, it would in fact suffice to trigger a massive forced mating across the globe in order to cause Eldian blood to surge throughout the world. And by adding Titan cerebrospinal fluid to the world's various food and water sources, whether in the water or in the animals' diets, Paradise would thus face 2 threats, large-scale earthworks on the one hand, and the transformation into titans on the other. And it is still possible to take things further. The original, having created the Ackermans, could evolve part of the population and set up a training program enabling them to awaken their powers. And from there, it would become possible to create an army of super soldiers. And to tell the truth, that's not all. The original must be able to increase the IQ of certain people to turn them into a sort of CIA agent, to ensure that no rebellion is launched in the various countries of the world. As you will have realized, there are countless ways to ensure peace in Paradise without resorting to mass extermination. But, as you will have realized, this plan has its drawbacks. The first being the certain death of the various Titan power holders who are subject to a 13-year limit, and the second being the sacrifice of Historia's descendants, the only people still possessing royal blood. Consequently, this solution, whilst being the most beneficial for Paradise and the rest of the world, will inevitably harm Eren's friends. This helps us understand something that is actually quite simple. Eren's actions are driven by a single objective. Once you realize that, everything becomes clearer. In order to save Armin, Reiner, and Annie, Eren must find a way to rid the world of the Titan's power. And to do so, he must necessarily show Ymir the way forward. And the only person capable of doing this is Mikasa. Eren therefore had to find a way to force Mikasa to eliminate him, to force Mikasa to choose her values over what she is enslaved by, her love. In Attack on Titan, all the characters are subject to impulses. These impulses therefore correspond to what they are enslaved by. For Eren, it was freedom. For Erwin, the quest for knowledge, and so on. These impulses will therefore give rise to a goal for each of them. A goal that will be able to satisfy that impulse. But on the other hand, there are their moral values. Values which, depending on the individual, will not necessarily align with their own impulse. And this is where Isayama's genius lies. Through the narrative, he ensures that his characters are faced with a dilemma. Should they follow their impulse or their moral values? And in Attack on Titan, all the characters faced with this dilemma will eventually choose their core values, whether on their own or thanks to the intervention of other characters. But this is true of everyone, with the exception of one.
これが自由だ。
Eren is the only character for whom his impulse was stronger than anything else. His desire for freedom, which he made clear to his friends, was so strong that even 80% of humanity was not enough to make him change course. Eren is therefore a true anomaly in the world of SNK, and we see this clearly in his conversation with Armin. He shows more emotion when speaking of Mikasa than when speaking of the billions of people he has personally exterminated. Be that as it may, all these elements allow us to address the inconsistencies, or at least the flaws, in the ending of Attack on Titan. For some, exterminating the whole of humanity was a necessity. There are even those who think that even Eren's friends had to go. But as explained in the video, Eren's friends are a priority, and it is essential that Mikasa kills Eren herself to show Ymir the way, and thus free the world from the power of the Titans, whilst at the same time saving Armin, Reiner and Annie. To be honest, I can see the point of this criticism, but if you think about it for a moment, it wouldn't make sense, because even setting aside Eren's true objectives, wiping out the entire human race would supposedly ensure lasting peace on Paradise Island. However, as explained in the very first part of the video, it was possible to achieve this without necessarily sacrificing billions of human lives, which would be rather daft. For some, the final discussion between Eren and Armin undermines Eren's credibility, given that he seems to suggest his actions aren't driven by any sort of rational reasoning, but simply by his impulses. But this is simply a misunderstanding of the dialogue. For what Eren is referring to is not linked to his objectives, but rather to the extermination of humanity. As he says, he was genuinely prepared to wipe out all of humanity. This action is therefore not solely motivated by the desire to be killed by Mikasa, but also by his impulse, as is, in fact, explicitly shown during the Great Collapse. Consequently, when Armin asks why, he is indeed talking about what might have motivated him to wipe out 100% of humanity, not all the actions he took to bring about this outcome. To be honest, this criticism surprises me, but for some people, the Ackermans can no longer access the path or undergo any kind of transformation, given that it is said the Ackermans are immune to Titan powers. But this is obviously false, because ultimately, the Ackermans are still Eldians. They simply have the distinction of not being able to be transformed into Titans or to suffer memory loss or other DNA alterations. They can therefore acquire new information, or, to put it another way, memories, as well as gain access to the path, which makes sense, given that, once again, they are Eldians.
それができなければ繰り返すだけだ。同じ歴史を、同じ過ちを、何度も。
And finally, the fact that a new war then breaks out cannot be considered a failure, given that Eren's true goal was, above all, to allow his friends to live to a ripe old age, something he succeeded in doing. Furthermore, one of the main messages of the manga is that the same mistakes will be repeated, and that the only way to ensure there is no more war is for there to be just one human left on Earth. As a result, the resumption of war was practically inevitable, and even if the entire human race had been wiped out, there's no guarantee the Eldians wouldn't have turned on one another at some point. And beyond all that, given that these events unfold at least a century after Eren's death, it no longer concerns him. Mind you, we could talk about Armin's thank you or the romance between Eren and Mikasa, but these are flaws that don't really matter unless you genuinely didn't like the ending. All this to say that the ending of SNK has no inconsistencies, all the characters' actions and the author's choices are perfectly in line with the manga. So, this dissatisfaction with the ending stems from other reasons and is linked to the fact that, well, everyone has their own tastes. I realize that might sound a bit ridiculous as an excuse, but it's actually as simple as that. Everyone has their own tastes. The key is to understand what that actually means in practice. But that's something I'll actually explore in a future video. But if we are to offer an initial answer, we must understand that everyone possesses what I call factors of appreciation and factors of depreciation. These factors vary in intensity from person to person, meaning that for some, the presence of a factor of appreciation will simply please them, whilst for others, it will make a work truly memorable. Conversely, factors of depreciation will displease them, or even go so far as to create genuine hatred. It is, in fact, a concept linked to tropes, but I consider a trope to be much more specific. Appreciation factors are much more general concepts, which I will expand on another time. However, in the case of Attack on Titan, I have noticed that the manga in general, and the entire final arc in particular, completely lacks two specific appreciation factors. And the first one we're going to look at is the moral compass. Attack on Titan is not an inspiring work. Its main objective is not to provide a path to follow. Unlike classic shonen, the majority of the messages conveyed are not intended to help an individual grow or inspire them. Although one cannot overlook the importance of continuing to move forward, apart from the very first few story arcs of the series, there is in fact no character who has had to put their determination to the test, or who has had to use it to solve a problem. Ultimately, The only path to follow that SNK conveys to us from start to finish is to act for the good of humanity, or, more generally, to act for the greater good. The problem is that, if we focus on the end of the series, although the main characters band together against Eren in order to save the world and thus do good, the final chapter counterbalances all of this, because listening to the discussion between Armin and Eren, one actually gets the impression that the path chosen by Eren was in fact the only one. So much so that having looked into what various readers think, it turns out that many people agree with Eren's decision. Many people agree with the idea of exterminating 80% of the population, and yet the very fact that the protagonists, including Mikasa, went so far as to kill Eren, tells us that his decision was the wrong one. As we demonstrated in the first part of the video, yes, that decision was indeed selfish, particularly unfair and cruel, but Isayama doesn't suggest this to us directly, because in the staging of the ending, particularly through Armin's words of thanks, we get the feeling that it was Eren who was right. This means that the substance and the form do not point in the same direction, because in substance, he is wrong, but in form, we get the impression that he is right. And when it comes to how it feels, it is indeed the form that counts, and this, in my view, is one of the main reasons for the dissatisfaction with the ending. Eren is not condemned at all. In fact, the opposite is true, and I sincerely believe that this is the main reason behind the dissatisfaction with the ending. For those for whom moral guidance is a significant factor in their appreciation, the form simply cannot justify Eren's actions. And besides, when speaking with critics of SNK, there will always come a point where they will cite the works they consider to be better, and you'll see that in the vast majority of cases, these works are moral guides. The second factor concerns the characters. I won't go into great detail on this point here, but the final part is notable for dismantling the entire aura surrounding Eren's character. Throughout Season 4, he has always been a rational, calculating character who displays a particular detachment, no matter the situation. However, during his final conversation with Armin, he first displays a certain melancholy, then distress, and finally exasperation. He actually shows human emotions in response to his situation, but this still has an impact on the relationship we had with this character. For some, there was a certain attachment, stemming from empathy, but for others, there was more of a sense of disappointment. And beyond all that, the entire final section didn't feature characters with particularly engaging energy. This remains a matter of personal opinion, but apart from Reiner and Levi, who incidentally was rather in the background, the rest of the cast wasn't particularly interesting, either as individual characters or in their overall dynamic. This is, for example, a flaw that a manga like JoJo would rarely, if ever, display. Be that as it may, in my view, it is your own take on these two factors that will determine your overall opinion of the ending. But on the other hand, the quality of an ending is not determined by opinion, but by the writing itself. As discussed in the video, the narrative remains consistent, the work's messages are upheld, and the conclusion is in keeping with the work's overall theme, because ultimately,
それができなければ繰り返すだけだ。同じ歴史を、同じ過ちを何度も。